In this section of the course, I'd like to talk to you about debugging the C# code. What we're going to do is we're going to talk through some of the debug techniques, most of which you should be familiar with VB scripting. Then I want to show you a demonstration of how we can use Microsoft's Visual Studio to debug the C# code, and then just some pointers on the Visual Studio licensing, which is pretty important. So let's have a quick look at some of the existing debug techniques. So in VB script, more often than not, we were using the message box function. This has now been replaced with something called Syspro message box, which we've seen in our demos to date. But just to recap, you'll find it in the callout functions, in the built-in functions, and you can set the title, the instructions, and the buttons. And as you press the buttons, you can trap the return value and do some logic around which buttons were pressed. The task dialog is a standard callout, Syspro callout, and as I said earlier in the course, none of the existing controls have changed. So you simply go to common callouts. It's the first one in the list, and when you double click it, you get this little wizard, and you can fill it in. You have an option to practice or show the dialog you're creating, and then finally insert the C# code into your script. None of this has changed, and you can see more detail of this in earlier courses. Write to tracer, again, a really useful call out here. It's in the common callouts again, quite a long way down in the list. And what this will do is output a message to the Syspro tracer. There's a full course on this, and it's really quite useful to help support people, because normally you don't see the tracer, but a support person can fire up the tracer and see messages coming to it and so on like that. I use that a lot. You can output to log files, which is very, very common for debugging and things like that. And if you go to the sample code tab here, one of the standard C# samples is a log file class, which you can put into your code, or you can just use it as a basis and create your own, and so on like that. And then finally, one of the other useful things to do when you're creating fairly large applications is to put things into the Windows event logs, and we'll have a look at this later. I can use this as an example of showing you how you can use something like Microsoft Copilot to generate C# code. So these are some of the standard techniques that one uses, and they just simply transfer through to C#. So what I'd like to do now is show you a demonstration on how we can actually use Microsoft's Visual Studio to dynamically debug the code as it's running. Okay, so here we are in our C# code of our demo, which should be familiar to you. And what I'd like to be able to do with this code is to say that when I press one of the buttons on the application toolbar, the on-user event will fire. I want the code to stop and go into a Visual Studio just-in-time debugger. Now, there are a couple of steps to that before we get going. First of all is we go to our built-in functions, scroll to the bottom, and there is a new function called Syspro debug break. So I'm going to put it immediately after the on-user event. Now, where you place Syspro debug break is where the code will stop and ask you whether you want to go into a just-in-time debugger. So if you've got loads and loads of lines of code, you may well insert this lower down in your code. But for our example, I want it to do it immediately. I press a button and the on-user event fires. So what's actually going to happen, we will, when we compile this and run it, the code will start. I'll press the button, on-user event will fire, immediately hit Syspro debug break and say to me, do you want to connect to the Visual Studio? Now, just to set the scene, just to let you know, I have got my version of Visual Studio already preloaded, and I'll explain why shortly. So that's the first step, insert Syspro debug break. The second step is to save this source code for debug. It's a slightly different format than normal, but just simply save it for debug, and then we exit the code. Now, once we've done that, what we want to do is just simply run our application. Okay, so up comes our application, which is great, and I'm just going to press run code. And straight away, it's hit the Syspro debug break function, and it's asking me, do I want to continue to, or do I want to debug? If I say no, it'll just carry on as normal. But if I say yes, what it'll say is, right, I need to connect to a Visual Studio just-in-time debugger. What do you want me to do? Do you want me to launch a new instance of Visual Studio, or do you actually want me to connect to an existing running instance? Now, the reason that I tend to fire up Visual Studio in its own right is that I found that when I just launch or ask it to launch a new instance of Visual Studio, occasionally Visual Studio will say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be automated, and it's a bit of a pain. So I preload Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that and say, OK. And what it's going to do now is say, well, where is my source code that you want me to debug? As it happens, we don't need to tell it because Syspro is about to pass all its C# code to Visual Studio. So we just simply cancel that, decompiles the source code, and here we are sitting in the decompiled code. The code now has stopped exactly on our Syspro debug break. You can see it highlighted here. And from this point on, those of you who are familiar with Visual Studio and C#, the debugger is exactly as you are used to. You just simply go through it step by step, and you can see the variables at the bottom. But if those of you who've never seen Visual Studio and the debugger, then I'll quickly nip through some of the things you can do, but you will need to look at a video maybe on the internet on how this actually works. So at the moment, we're actually sitting here. We can put breakpoints in here if we want to, and then we can run to a breakpoint, or we can take them out. And that's quite useful because you can put the Syspro debug break immediately after the on-user event, and then put a breakpoint further down in your code, maybe down here, or as a result of an if statement or a case statement and so on like that. At the same time, we can also step into our code or step over functions and so on like that, just like any advanced debugger. So what we're going to do at the moment is I'm going to just simply press F11, and you can see now that it's actually moved off Syspro debug break, and it's now on the first statement of our code. So we'll just step through some of this here, and it'll say if the event type is T. Well, if we hover over event type, we can actually see, or rather, if it's not T, go back, it actually is T. So what we'll do is we'll go down here, and what's the event ID? It's 1002, which is great. So we will go here, and we can actually see it picking up. And if we hover over here, we can see that it's got the word Andy and Latham. And if we step over here, we can see our full name. So you can see that we can hover over any variable and see exactly what's going on. And then at the bottom here, we can also see our variables saying, here's our first name, our last name, there's my full name, and so on like that. And if I simply run the code, up will come our Syspro message box. OK. And if we go back to our code here, we're actually sitting quite nicely. So what we'll do is we'll run it again with the person option there. We'll go function F11, go on through here. And this time it's actually a 1003. So we will see that it's saying I want a new person class, and it's stepped into our class for us, so we can actually trace through what's actually happening in our class. And you can see what's going on here as well. So what we can see here is our first name is set, our last name is set, but interestingly, if we come down here and we expand the variable P, we can see our two properties. And if we just simply step over here, we can see that our message is there. And if we just simply run our code, there we will see it. Now, one word of caution. I am using Syspro message box here, and occasionally what you'll find is the Syspro message box or any message box will get confused with the layers on your screen of where should it be displaying behind Visual Studio or in front of it, or behind Syspro or in front of it, and so on like that. So one of the things I tend to do is run the Visual Studio on one screen and have Syspro on another, so that if I do get a message box popping up, my code is actually, I can see it and I can actually interact with it rather than having to faff around. So you get the general gist of what we're going to do. I'm not going to go into any great detail about how the debuggers or the features of the Visual Studio debugger is, other than you can change the code in here. You can change the value of variables in here. You set it right if there's an error. But any changes you make whilst you are debugging can't be copied back into Syspro. You'll need to save it and then amend your app designer code later. So when we finished, we basically close that down, and we're back to where we are. And it's as simple as that, basically. So I'm going to finish now and then move on to just talk a little bit about licensing. Before I shoot off and discuss Visual Studio licensing with you, I thought it might be quite useful just to recap what we've been through in a single slide in case you need to show it to anybody else. So just as a start, remember that we add the Syspro debug break Syspro command, which you'll find in the built-in functions within App Designer, and you'll pop that where you want the Visual Studio to kick in. Then once you've done that in your source code, you will save the code for debug. It just saves it in a different format. Once you've saved it, you will run your application. Typically, I use the run option within the editor itself. And as the app starts to execute the C# code, it will hit our Syspro debug break and prompt you if you want to start a debug session. If you say no, it'll just skip over it. If you say yes, then Visual Studio will start the process of saying, right, which debug session do you want to attach to? If you haven't got Visual Studio loaded, it'll say, do you want a new instance? As we discussed earlier on, I tend to preload it and select it in that list, but that's by the by. Once you've selected your instance, you may find, particularly if it's starting up new, that Visual Studio will say, well, I'm starting a new debug session. Where's the source code? Now, as it happens, Syspro or the app designer will be passing its source code automatically to Visual Studio. So you basically say cancel to this prompt if it comes up. And once you've done that, the Visual Studio will receive the source code from App Designer. And once you're in Visual Studio Debug, you can do whatever you like to the code, check the variables, change the values, change the code even. Once you've satisfied yourselves that you've worked out what the problem is with your code, you will exit the debugger. As you come out of Visual Studio, it may well ask you if you want to save the changes or the code as a brand new solution. Just simply say don't save to that, because in fact the source code clearly is going to be within App Designer. And that's it. Two things you've got to actually remember. Any code changes that you make within Visual Studio to get your logic working can't be passed through back to App Designer. So any changes you make, you'll need to repeat within App Designer source code and recompile. And finally, don't forget to remove the Syspro debug break line. Otherwise, the next time you run your app, it'll start with this prompt, do you want to debug again? And it's as simple as that. So I'll leave you with that, and we will now start on our licensing. I just want to spend a couple of minutes to give you some pointers on the Microsoft licensing for Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code. First thing to note, though, is that Syspro don't provide either of these products. They're Microsoft products. So you have to navigate the Microsoft licensing models. So it is up to the user of these products, or more accurately, maybe the user's business, to make sure that they're licensed correctly to use. And just to recap, we would use Microsoft Visual Studio to do the #debug Syspro debug function we were looking at earlier on, and we could use Visual Studio Code to generate standalone class libraries and things. We'll see that shortly. So there are several versions of Visual Studios. There's the Visual Studio Enterprise and Professional, and these are targeted at professional developers and software houses making software for resale. And as you might expect, they require a full-blown license because you are writing software for commercial gain. And then there is a Visual Studio Community Edition, which is free if you satisfy certain conditions. And this is typically for students and people learning or people not creating software for commercial gain. And under certain conditions, businesses can use these things, and we'll use it, and we'll see it in a short while. Visual Studio Code is free, but it is not linked into App Designer, so you can't have it won't work with the Syspro debug function that we have. So I nipped into Google, typed in Visual Studio licensing, and the AI came up with this summary of what's what. And as you might expect, it's talking about professional development, commercial use, but tucked down here for the community edition, there is something saying it is free if the users can access the software for user acceptance testing without a paid license, but they cannot use live production data. Now, I think, and it's my personal interpretation, that using the Syspro debug or debugging software is part of user acceptance testing, and therefore you ought to be able to use Visual Studio Community Edition for doing that sort of debugging. And then if we look at Visual Studio Code, it comes completely free, and you can generate your own class libraries like the person class that we were doing, or anything like that using this code should you want to. But the final thing that I would ask you to do is check the details. These change constantly, and if you're in any doubt, ring Syspro support and ask their advice. You do not want to be running into trouble with Microsoft licensing. Okay, enough of my preaching to you. We'll move on now to VB script migration and code conversion.